I'm excited to be continuing our discussion series with tonight's event on restoring public space. I'm really excited to be welcoming our guest artists, Gabriel Sosa and Sara Rivera. I will say more about them in just a moment, but I wanted to preview our time together. Essentially, our time together is going to unfold in roughly 3 parts. First, building on Gabriel and Sara's public art practice, we're actually going to turn our focus inward by doing a bit of writing and thinking about how our personal expressions can kind of take on new life when inserted into the public realm. Then we're going to get to hear from tonight's guest artists and educators about their practice. They're going to discuss various projects that they've been a part of and the role of language in shaping the dynamics of public space. Finally, in the last portion of our time together, we're going to take a moment to sort of step back, to zoom out, to consider the role of wonder in public space, and also spatial practices that can perhaps expand our sense of connection, not only to one another, but to the communities that we're a part of. That being said, I wanted to give a bit of a disclaimer that tonight's event might feel slightly different than perhaps other Zoom events that you may have been a part of. And that's because our time together is supposed to feel just a little bit more like a conversation. It's not a webinar or a lecture or necessarily even an artist talk in the conventional sense. And the reason for that is simple. While we have ideas about public art and public space, we're by no means the sole experts. We know that everyone has important ideas to share about that topic, and we believe that hearing from you will only enrich our time together. On that note, I wanted to more formally and properly welcome and introduce tonight's guest artists and educators, Gabriel Sosa and Sara Rivera. 2 artists that I believe are subtly, but I think quite substantively, reimagining the dynamics of public space through their public art practice. If you live in Boston, you may have seen this through Gabriel's recent No Es Fácil project, which has staged messages of solidarity on billboards throughout Boston's immigrant communities. And if you go back a bit further, you might also recall Sara's wonderful Pudding Rock Banner project, a participatory public art exhibit that invited us to imagine and co-dream together out on the Boston Harbor Islands a few summers ago. Gabriel and Sara, there's a lot more that I could say about both of you and your wonderful work, but I would just like, in the interest of time, to simply welcome you and to invite you to take things from here.
Thank you.
So we are going to start to warm up with the activity portion, the sort of workshop portion of our event. So I'm going to share my screen here. All right, so we were thinking about using a kind of prompt that would get you all thinking about some of the public spaces in your community and in your own life, and then writing from there. So I have a set of questions, and I want you to start by thinking about a public space within your community. That can be immediately in your neighborhood, it can be somewhere within your larger city or environment. And public just meaning that it's accessible to the public, right? So it could be a park by your house, it could be a downtown square, it could be, a certain stretch of your neighborhood or community. And I want to start out by just having you think through these questions to sort of position yourself in relationship to that space. What do you like best about that place? What do you connect with in that space? What do you struggle with or want to see changed? And what is your story within that place? So how did you come to have a relationship with it? Is this a place that you grew up close to, where you have a history? Is it a place that you are fairly new to? So you don't have to necessarily write out your responses to that, but what do you think, Gabriel? We'll just kind of take a couple minutes to think through it before we start.
Yeah, let's just give everyone a moment just to think about what that might be, and then we can move on to the actual writing of it.
So, even if you're still sort of thinking through these questions, I'm going to go into the prompt itself. So, you can continue to think about this as you listen to that and as you start to write. So, the prompt that we're going to use is to write a letter to the public space or community space that you're thinking of. Epistolary writing, meaning writing in the form of a letter, is something that we use often in creative writing. There are novels in the form of letters, there are poems in the form of letters. And something that is really helpful about this kind of writing is that it sort of helps us immediately access a very intimate and personal voice, right? Because a letter implies a kind of personal relationship. So you can think about, if this is a letter to the space that you're thinking of, is it a love letter? Is it another kind of letter? I don't know, an apology letter? There are so many different kinds of tones that a letter can take, right? And you've just done a bit of brainstorming around your sort of particular relationship to this place. So some of the details that you came up with in that brainstorm can sort of inform how you're speaking to that space. And in our day-to-day lives, if we're writing letters, we're generally writing them to people. So another part of creative practice and creative epistolary practice is this idea that we can write to non-human entities, right? We can write to a place, we can write to an object, we can write to a feeling, and see what it feels like to speak intimately to that as if it were a person. Does anyone have any questions about that prompt? And Gabriel, do you have anything to add?
No, just really quickly, as you're writing, I mean, feel free to write as you wish. You're welcome to share afterward, but don't feel like you have to. So just please take this time and write kind of from the place of wherever you're at right now. Don't feel inhibited in terms of sharing or not sharing.
Yeah, it's you'll have the option to share or not, so don't worry if it sounds good or if it's good enough for us or anything like that. Just allow it to be personal. So we're going to do this for 10 minutes, and I am going to send both the opening questions and that prompt. I'm going to put them both in the chat as well. So we have 10 minutes, so we'll come back around 6:25, 6:26.
And feel free to turn your cam and mic off as you write, so you don't feel like everyone's kind of watching you or anything as you write. And we'll see you in 10 minutes.
If you're not quite done yet, that's okay. I always like to say we can find a pausing place rather than an endpoint.
Yeah, agreed. So go ahead and just take a minute to read through what you've written, and we'd like to just give some space for anybody that wants to share. Either a portion or a particular phrase that you've written, or just kind of general thoughts or feelings. We have a particular task that we have for you afterward. But before we give that to you, we just want to open up some space in case anyone wants to share.
I can share. Should I just share what I wrote for my letter?
Sure.
It's a love letter. So it's not very long. Dear Arnold Arboretum, I love you. You are so vast and open. You have been a true friend through every season. While the pandemic raged and continues to rage, you have stayed a beautiful constant. But just like my mood changes, so does yours. In parts, you have a woodsy river vibe, and in others, a wide open plain vibe. From your pine trees as snow fell to your crab apples as spring hit, you've been along the ride for conversations, phone calls, podcasting, and audiobook listening, and quiet moments of reflection. You are open to everyone, but sometimes it's hard to find a parking spot. Lucky for me, you're within walking distance. As your lilacs are in full bloom, it gives me hope. I don't know what I would do without you.
I love that, and actually, I also wrote about the Arboretum, and I think a lot of you know that Victoria is my wonderful wife. So we do share a lot of time in the Arboretum together. And Raquel, I saw that you just put in the chat that you also wrote about it.
I got married in the Arboretum, so yes.
That's so
love
sweet.
The Arboretum. Have a lot of history there. Crazy things and wonderful and beautiful things as well.
Thank you so much, Victoria.
Does anyone else want to share? You can either read your letter or just mention what the place was.
Yeah, you could tell us about the place that you chose to write about instead of reading, if that's more comfortable.
And if not, that's okay too.
I'm happy to share just because I also wrote about a green space.
Sure.
Okay, mine is to my community garden. Dear Healy Garden, I won the lottery, and by that I mean that I have an 8x4 plot of land that's mine to cultivate. I'm not much of a gardener, I'll admit, but nonetheless, I find a bit of comfort in the invitation to grow something and the sense of serendipity I get when I'm there. I never know who else will be there and what will grow. The sense of mystery is a reminder that new things are possible and things are happening even if I can't yet see them.
Thank you, Raquel. I love both of those letters. What I love about this form is that what tends to come out feels very conversational, right? It doesn't feel very formal and distant. It feels very personal. So I feel the individual relationships you both have to those spaces. So I'll give one more second if anyone else wants to, and otherwise, if you just want to, say the place name, you can throw that in the chat. We would love to see some of them. I'll throw mine in there. Oh, Prospect Park.
So what we'd like you to do is take what you've written, and when you have another moment, it doesn't have to be now, when you have a quiet moment, read through it. And we'd like you to go ahead and
I'll share
it. Yeah, there we go. Exactly that. We'd like you to go ahead and pick a particular phrase that you feel stands on its own from what you wrote. Whether it's the Arboretum, Hudson Street Stoop, David Square, Farmers Market in Carbo in North Carolina. And go ahead and write this on a small piece of paper or a note card. It can be an index card, post-it note, line paper, a copy paper, whatever you have around, and place that somewhere in the public space that you wrote about. If you wrote about a public space where you are physically not near at the moment, that's okay too. Think about the spaces that you move in, what your routine might be. And we want you just to go ahead and leave it there. Maybe you have a particular walk that you take, or maybe you're not a walker, but you take the bus, or occasionally you walk to the store. Go ahead and just leave that in the public space somewhere. It could be on the bench. It could be on a lamppost. It could be maybe even in the grocery store, just right under your favorite cereal. Anywhere in the public space. Just go ahead and leave that and let someone else encounter it.
The poet Terence Hayes has this great way of thinking about phrases that stand on their own in a piece of writing. He calls them hotspots, that they're moments that draw some energy and some heat to themselves. Maybe they're very true or moving or surprising, even if you take them out of context. So yeah, choose one of those and leave it somewhere. Did anyone have questions about this little task?
Also photograph it. Photograph it, and as Raquel put in the chat, you can go ahead and tag it on Instagram if you like, or email the photo to us at info@Urbano Project.
Yeah, it'd be cool if these became a little collective installation, and if someone going through the Arboretum could find like 4 of them.
And so, the reason we wanted y'all to have this activity is just because Sara and I share so much in our respective art practices, thinking about language and text and the power of words and the imperfection of words and the different ways that they can be encountered and interpreted. And I think especially over the past few years for both of us, we've been really devoting a lot of critical thought, both in our own respective art practices, and then together on a few things that we've collaborated on, really thinking about the power of language in the public space. And I think particularly over the past year, living through this global pandemic, our relationships to the public space have been re-examined, have been scrutinized in different ways. Those relationships have at times been laced with fear or skepticism, but also joy and comfort. And so what we wanted to start out with tonight is that activity, just to give you all a little window into some of our own thought practice. And then also just have it serve a little bit as a segue into the second part of tonight, in which Sara and I are going to share some images with you and talk a little bit about some recent projects that we've done. So if it's all right with you, I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay, everybody see this okay?
Okay.
All right, so a lot of my work deals with language and memory and what's fallible about both of those things. And so over the past few years, I've really, drawing has always formed an integral part of my art practice. So has video and sound. And over the past few years, I've really started to think about the public space as a way to start conversation, as a place to insert messages and ideas, and also become really interested in this idea of subversion, right? And kind of being able to insert unexpected texts into expected places. Or the opposite, right? Insert perhaps something that's expected in a place that's totally unexpected. So what you're looking at here is a piece called "Do You Understand What I'm Saying?", which is something I did in 2018 in Davis Square. I think someone in the group wrote something about Davis Square. So if you know this area in Somerville, these are two windows that are sandwiched between a CVS and a Boston Sports Club. And so what you're looking at here is an installation where I took a series of questions that had been overheard in Boston area courtrooms. And I went ahead and pasted them onto these windows between the two businesses. I also matched the red so that, again, this idea of subversion, right? Trying to make it appear as if perhaps there was some kind of connection to either one or both of these businesses. A lot of my work comes from my work as an interpreter in the state court system, where I am orally translating legal proceedings into Spanish on proceedings which range from criminal cases to housing, probate. And so each of these questions were questions that were posed from a judge to a defendant. And they all kind of insinuate, and you can see here some of them on the next slide, ideas of skepticism or doubt. So things like, has anyone threatened or pressured you to give up your rights today? Where they explain to you in your native language. You have a look on your face that I haven't seen before. What's going on? Did anyone force you? Is your mind clear today? You're under the influence of any drugs, alcohol, or medication. And so if you look closely behind these texts, there are some drawings I posted onto the back wall of this window space. So there's maybe about a foot between that wall and then the red text. And so those drawings in the back are sketches of possible responses to these questions, right? The responses that a defendant may provide. So kind of using that distance and that difference in aesthetic to point to the difference between the language of officialdom and what might be language of the people, something that's much more every day and isn't as charged, and therefore, unfortunately, within the U.S. justice system, oftentimes not as powerful.
And Gabriel, I wanted to jump in, and something that also struck me about this piece is the dichotomy between what types of texts are generally private and what types of texts are generally public. So the fact that these are things that you would hear in sort of a very closed and private environment, and what is the sort of potential of taking those kinds of moments and putting them in public space. So I don't know, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, totally. I think I was really interested in kind of catching people off guard to a certain extent. As you said, these are things that happen in very enclosed, confined spaces, which by law are public spaces. Anyone can walk into a courtroom, but people aren't exactly welcome in a courtroom. A courtroom is quite the opposite. It's an extremely unwelcoming space, even to the people who are supposed to be there, who are expected to be there, right? So the idea was to kind of take these questions, which to me, because of my job, have become something that's so regular, so everyday, and then really recontextualize them and kind of cause someone to stop in their tracks and say, well, wait a second, this is definitely not something put up by Boston Sports Club or CVS, even though at first it might look that way. This was something done through the O Miami Poetry Festival. It's a festival done in Miami every April. They just wrapped it up, where the objective is for each resident of Miami-Dade County to encounter a poem throughout that month, which is National Poetry Month. And so different artists and writers are invited to collaborate with them. And so what I had done a couple years ago was this piece, which is called Para llevar o para tomar aquí, which means for here or to go. And so what you're looking at is a pastelito de guayaba, which is a Cuban pastry, something that I grew up with in Miami. And it's extremely common for people to go to a Cuban bakery, of which there are so many in Miami, and get a box of pastelitos to take it home, to have breakfast with your family, to take them to work with you, to show up at friends' house with them, and really this idea of sharing. And so what I did is I had bakery tissue paper printed out with this phrase on it, para llevar o para tomar aquí, but with the text, with the verbs changed. So in other words, it became, to for here, or to go for here, or to cry for here, or to triumph for here, or to gossip, and then really kind of engage in this playful conversation of switching those verbs out for things that were far less than expected. This was something I had done in Colombia in 2019. I was an artist in residence at Lugar a Dudas, which is a cultural center in Cali, a city which very recently has been at the center of nationwide protests in Colombia against the Colombian government. And one of the things that struck me most about Cali was this saying, Cali es caliente, right? Which literally means Cali is hot, but at the same time can have so many other interpretations, right? It can have sexual connotations. It can have connotations dealing with crime. And so what I did is kind of took this rhythmic saying, which is so common and so familiar throughout the city of Cali, and used a list that I had made of words, of adverbs that start with C to describe Cali, and put this around the perimeter of Lugar a Dudas, of the residency.
I had a question about that piece.
Yeah.
So we just did this exercise where we're writing about places that we're very familiar with, right? That we have a history in. And I know you've done a lot of these projects where you're sort of the artist in residence in a city or in a country that you haven't been in before. So I'm interested to know, when you're in a new place like that, how do you go about starting to source text? How do you first start to approach a site? Before you figure out kind of what you're going to put there?
That's a really good question. And that's sort of that's a trope that a lot of us are all too familiar with. The artist that just sort of parachutes into somewhere and starts making work, and goes ahead and does some big project, and then they sail away, never to be heard from again, and kind of are very divorced from that community. And for me, it's very much dependent on the place. There are some places where I feel like I have been able to make a project that's very intimate, and that it resonates, and other places not. And I think Cali, for me, is one of the former. It's somewhere where before I arrived, and while I was there, read a lot, learned so much about its history, and in many ways, in its people, in the rhythm of daily life, and its quirks, and its history, in many ways, felt a lot like Miami, a lot like Havana, and my parents being Cuban, and my relationship to both of those places being so powerful. There was just, so much that I had encountered with the word Cali and this sort of rhythmic description of the city. And also, I think it's a place with a lot of local pride, and even in its history and the way that Caleños talk about the city, it sort of becomes its own character in its own history. It becomes almost this personified character, if that makes sense. And so there was so much that was, Cali es caliente, Cali es cálida. There's a famous book of short stories by Andrés Caicedo, which is sort of the favorite son of Cali, which has a really rich literary history. It's called Cali Calabozo, right? So again, this kind of like rhythmic idea of the seas. And so just kind of in conversation with people, kept encountering these things. Even like, I don't know, over breakfast with like, one of the other artists or whatever, we would just hear someone say, oh, bueno, Cali es caliente. And it was like, what? Why is everybody saying this? So it just seemed like kind of an appropriate thing to do. It seemed right, according to my relationship with the place. But I appreciate that question. And then here, I think, as Raquel had mentioned, through a grant by Now and There, which facilitates public art projects in Boston, I, from July 2020 to January 2021, had installed a series of 9 billboards throughout Boston that considered ideas of hope and solidarity in the neighborhoods which had most been affected by COVID, which are also neighborhoods with very large Spanish-speaking populations. And so some of these billboards were in English, some were in Spanish. This one was on Blue Hill Ave and Julian Street. Tremendo lío, pero tú sigue. What a mess, but keep going. This one, esto no es un cachú, hay que meterle mano. This ain't easy, but we got to work on it. All of them kind of dealt with this idea of something not being easy or something being challenging, but to keep at it, or to remain calm. And so this one in particular, this was in Eggleston Square on Washington and School Streets, and kind of considered Dominican slangs. Is that there's such a large Dominican community in the area. Un cachú in Dominican Spanish is something easy. And then this is the last slide, a very recent project. This was done at Boston Cyber Arts.
One question.
Oh, yeah. Dale.
So I was wondering if you could just talk for a second about, I really like the way you've spoken in the past about why you chose billboards for this project. Mm-hmm. Because we just saw this project, the Para Llevar o Para Tomar Aquí, that was so intimate, right? Such a small scale, something that you take with you. And billboards, of course, are such a large scale. They have such a huge presence in public space. So mm-hmm. I wanted to know if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, for me, this was a grant that I had received in January of 2020. The objective was basically how that particular grant works is you participate in a seminar with other artists who have received it, thinking about public art, talking about it, all of its pitfalls, its marvels, its difficulties. And so the idea was for this to go up in summer 2020, and then be up for 3 months to 3 years. And the pandemic hit. We were all told that we could have an extension and could do it summer 2021. But I thought to myself, well, I kind of want to make something now. I kind of want to stick to the original schedule and really use this project as a way to offer something, right? Because it's like, well, what can an artist offer in the midst of a pandemic? And the thing I kept thinking to myself is like, well, art isn't going to save anybody, but maybe we can offer some kind of space for critical thought, for solidarity, for a smile, for something. And so there's such a rich history of artists who have used billboards. Felix Gonzalez Torres, who Sara, you and I have talked about a lot. Barbara Kruger, Dred Scott, Larry Sultan, and Mike Mandel, Guerrilla Girls, right? The list kind of goes on, and it was exciting to participate in that history. And billboards for me originally were kind of maybe like choice F, choice G. And then once the pandemic hit, it was like, well, no, this is going to be choice A now. I think it was a clear way to think about language in the public space, especially considering social distancing and things like that. So that's how I settled on billboards. And then this piece was a Boston Cyber Arts, which for those of you in Boston, it's in JP. It's actually at the Green Street station. It's a little art gallery that's been there since the late 90s. And this is a window installation where, again, this notion of subverting, of really kind of allowing a public space to masquerade as something else. I had covered the windows with newspapers, kind of to make it look sort of like a commercial space in transition. And then there was a little screen peeking out. And so there was a particular phrase that was running along the screen in a ticker tape format from one side to the other. And so I had been thinking a lot about patience. One, this being in a train station, and then also just patience in terms of activism, thinking about when to take action and when to hold and when to wait, and a lot of that sort of informed the billboards as well. But so the phrase that you see here is the beginning of la paciencia es un árbol de raíz amarga, pero de fruto dulces, right? Which means patience is a tree with bitter roots, but it bears sweet fruits. And what I did is I switched it around so that it reads that, but then it also reads patience is a tree with sweet roots, but it bears bitter fruits. So, really just kind of fascinated with the idea of how we can take the public space and transform it in some way that's subtle and allows people to have some kind of moment where they stop, where they realize that something isn't quite right, isn't what they expected, and to give people to have that moment of discovery and that moment of reflection.
I really like that idea of a moment of ambiguity. We talk because so many of these public spaces, you're used to seeing text in a commercial context. So seeing something different, seeing a poem, seeing something that is not quite that, there's always a little moment of sort of mystery or ambiguity. And I was thinking about that in your first project as well. Even, once you start by approaching the window installation and you see one layer of it, and then there's something else behind it that's a little bit less visible from far away. So I like these sort of layers of interaction that artwork in public space can give us.
Which, Sara, I think is a beautiful transition into your work. And the next slide.
Yeah, so a lot of my process in my public artworks, and particularly my artworks that involve text in public space, are community based. So I generally start off working with a particular community, getting to know people within that community. And the first phase of my text sourcing is usually interviews and oral histories. And from there, I'm generally figuring out, okay, how do I facilitate sort of the placement of people's stories or poetry in public space in a way that is meaningful or that speaks to that particular community, their needs or their interests or their sort of larger story. So this was a project that I did in 2019 called Pathways, which was during my time as a Story Maps Fellow at the Santa Fe Art Institute. And I was partnering with an organization called Youth Works of Santa Fe, which I'm in New Mexico, by the way. I didn't know if I said that. I'm in Albuquerque. So this organization provides wraparound community supports and alternate sort of career and educational pathways to youth who have fallen out of traditional educational systems, youth who are homeless or formerly incarcerated, and so can't follow sort of the regular established path that you're accustomed to in sort of organizing their lives, their careers. So I got to know a lot of these young people and talked a lot to them about how they sort of saw the next stages in their lives and how they were creating pathways for themselves. And so that was the kind of installation we ended up making. I made several pathway installations in which their stories and poems were situated in public space. And I was thinking a lot about how these young people related to their community. Santa Fe is a city that is in some ways very strangely stratified. There's a really sort of strong tourism industry, and there are a lot of really wealthy people who live there, and then there are parts of the city that are much poorer. And so in some ways, a lot of these young people felt like they didn't have access to a lot of parts of their city. Even the bus system didn't take them to certain parts of the city at reasonable times. So I used a lot of materials that are sort of seen as the traditional aesthetic of Santa Fe, traditional materials within the city, adobe and natural clay, in sort of creating these installations. And this clay pathway was installed at Youth Works. And then the next image is also of one of these pathway installations that was made of sort of these hand-built adobe letters and an earthen pathway that went through the Santa Fe Art Institute.
What does this say, Sara?
This went all the way to the front of the building. So these are the last few words in this poem that this young woman wrote, and it was, "Come and have a glimpse of what the world can be." So it was sort of leading people into the space. So the next few projects I have on here are, oh no, sorry. The next few projects on here are projects that I was lead artist on through my work as part of the Public Art Collaborative, Friends of the Orphan Signs, here in Albuquerque. And we take abandoned signage along Route 66 in Albuquerque and turn those signs on abandoned or unused lots into public artworks with involvement from the community. And a lot of these historic signs have been sort of grandfathered in through different businesses, so they've been here for a really long time. And the Caravan nightclub was a really important part of the community, particularly the Latinx and Hispanic community in Albuquerque in the 60s and the 70s. I think it closed down maybe in the 90s. It was a site of like ranchera music and dancing. So this site is now being turned into a new public library, and it's in what is called the International District of Albuquerque. So it's an area with large immigrant community and very multicultural community. And it's an area that hasn't actually had a public library before. The closest ones are sort of peripheral to this area. So this project called Keywords, I went to all of the public libraries around this area and held free writing workshops to anyone around there, anyone who was in the library at the time who wanted to just come in and tell some of their stories. And we, for a year, so it's still actually ongoing, we put those words up on the reader board at the old nightclub sign.
And Sara, I don't know if this is maybe on the next slide or not, but I mean, for a lot of these marquees, many of them are in Spanish. I was curious if you could talk a little bit about the role of bilingualism in your work.
Yeah, you know, I grew up in a bilingual household, so I've always been very interested in moving between languages. It's always been a big part of my work. And Albuquerque and New Mexico in general is a place with its own particular language history. The relationship with Spanish here is a very complicated relationship. There are a lot of people whose families have been here for generations. Spanish was, the first colonial language of New Mexico, and it was the main language of the state up until, I believe, the 1960s. And then through a lot of language ordinances, particularly in schools, a lot of families lost their Spanish. It was very penalized. So you had sort of a language that was colonial to begin with, and then that was also sort of taken away from people later on. So you have a lot of people who don't speak Spanish, but who have a really particular attachment to certain phrases or little snippets of Spanish. So I've been interested in playing with that on the signage. We get a lot of sort of snippets of Spanish when we're doing these community workshops, and we present them bilingually, so we also get a lot of people who write particularly in Spanish. So
here we go.
All right, I'll go through these next couple really quickly. This was related. It was also a marquee reader board project through Orphan Signs. This was an abandoned donut mart, abandoned like gas station and donut mart. And we started out, I know Gabriel uses a lot of sort of wordplay in his work, and thinking about and being playful with words. So that was what we initially were doing with this sign, because there were letters left on the sign when it was abandoned that said any size fountain, 99 cents, ATM, EBT inside. And so I started by scrambling up those letters and making any poetry that I could just from those letters, and thinking a bit about abandonment and how we sort of lift ourselves out of a feeling of abandonment. So those were some of the types of phrases that I was playing with. So this was a late 2020 project called Revision. This was a collaboration between myself and a poet named Becca Alderete-Baca. And we were thinking very much about our positionality as two self-identified women of color who have very different histories within New Mexico. Her family has been here for generations, and mine were new transplants when I was a kid. So we had access to historical photo archives through the Albuquerque Museum, And we're particularly interested in images of women of color and finding a way to sort of bring those bodies back into public space. So we combined text and image for these compositions, and a lot of them had to do with memory and sort of holding on to memory.
It's interesting. I mean, because you have mentioned, Sara, this idea of kind of the history of language in New Mexico, right, and the role of Spanish. And I mean, when I was in residence at Santa Fe Art Institute, I had never been to New Mexico before, and that was one of the things that most struck me is really just how the history of oppression and takeover and elimination at different levels. I mean, elimination of people, of human lives, of certain languages, was still kind of very palpable in the historical memory of New Mexico. I feel like when I was there, I just kind of barely grazed the surface of it. But when I guess I'm trying to condense this question into something that's actually answerable. With a piece like this, like who's your audience? Like who do you want to reach most?
So in these sites, we're sort of thinking about, normally this project is a little unusual in that we use kind of small text on the signs, and generally we're aiming for big readable text. And so we were thinking a lot about having sort of like an intimate experience with a large sign. This is an area between like two schools and with several bus stops underneath the signs. And it's sort of like the last walkable stretch of Nob Hill, this historic area of Albuquerque. So we were interested in sort of a slightly mysterious and intimate experience with people walking and standing under these signs. And, because so many people have really, I don't know, long histories within New Mexico, we sort of wanted to reach people and see if these historical images could get them thinking about their own relationship to sort of place and land. And some of the images that we used that didn't have people in them were images of landscape, like aerial images of the arroyos and the acequias. So we thought that maybe these were subtle ways of getting people to think about their relationship to place. And particularly because one of them is on the grounds of a school, we've had some conversations with young people who are really just starting to understand like their own history within the city and things like that.
Sara, I'm wondering if we can go back a slide to the one that you showed previously. It was actually wonderful to see this because in a way, you're also a seed. So my question to you is, especially with respect to our current political discourse, which is so incredibly polarized, dominated by, partisan gridlock, such that it can be easy to lose sight for what we're, actually for in the productive sense rather than just against. My question is, in that context, what does planting a seed like this or an invitation for us to wonder and co-dream together, which public art does so well, what does that accomplish, and why might that be a particularly necessary social practice in this time?
It's interesting. I was sort of thinking about this in relationship to the conversations that have happened within the Black Lives Matter movement around abolitionist frameworks and defunding the police. And so much of what happens in those conversations is sort of an immediate gridlock that comes from an inability to start to imagine something, right? A lot of people are asking like, what's, how do we go about doing this in terms of like actual immediate policy and things like that? And I think a lot about how the first step is just opening yourself up to an idea, right? The first step is being able to even dream or imagine or speculate, what would a world without prisons look like, or what would a world without policing look like? And so I like this idea of a seed, or the way you put it, co-dreaming, just the fact that maybe you can start to open your mind to something. And maybe that's part of the role public art or text in public space can have sometimes.
And Sara, I know you have one more slide at the end.
Yeah, well, but we're a little bit limited on time, so maybe we can just go into the Q&A portion. This is an installation in progress. That will be in a community center.
Exciting.
I see we have one question in the chat.
Yeah, let's take that one next. Sure, let's go there. I believe that was from Emily, is it? Emily, I can read your question for you, or perhaps you'd like to do that if you're with us. Okay, I'll read it. Similar to the earlier point, I think this was something that you mentioned, Gabriel, about residencies and how artists approach spaces they are new to. My question is about your approaches to permanent versus temporary installations. And maybe if we can get a quick answer on this one, and then we'll move forward.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that definitely doesn't have an easy answer. I think in terms of something being permanent or temporary, a lot of that just comes along with the logistics of a space. A lot of times things are temporary. Actually, the only permanent public installation I have done is actually also in Cali, and it's a sewer cover where basically I took out the existing sewer cover and put in one that I had designed with different phrasing on it, and it's there embedded into the sidewalk for posterity. And you kind of just never really know sometimes if something you plan on putting in temporary might become permanent, or the other way around. My experience has been mainly that things are temporary because of whatever sort of logistics surrounding that space. But people change, opinions change, perspectives change, so you kind of never really know whether it's going to be one or the other.
Yeah, and we, for something like orphan signs, it's the same thing. We're working with sites that have sometimes these signs are on abandoned lots for years, and then someone buys the lot and wants our sign gone. So we've even had, we have 2 or 3 permanent installations that are made with, it's also material consideration, because many of our temporary installations are made with those reader board letters or with vinyl that can sort of be printed over the sign. And then the permanent installations, a lot of them are LED displays and things like that. But we've even had to move one of those. So a lot of times it has to do for those projects with sort of ownership of the sign, what's going to happen to the sign, whether we know what's going to happen. And for myself, or sort of my practice outside of orphan signs, I tend to work with a lot of found and ephemeral materials. Those tend to be the materials that I'm drawn to. So it's just a very different material consideration. Like the installation in progress is going to be a permanent installation. So those are cast, it's made out of cast gypsum, whereas my projects that could sort of be ephemeral or deteriorate were made out of different kinds of materials. So it depends on site. It depends on sort of what materials you're interested in using. And yeah, I don't know. We've been thinking a lot about monuments in the past year, and one question I've seen come up is, does a monument have to be like this permanent, commodified representation of a person in public space, or can a monument be a space that has continuously changing dialogue within it? So it's an interesting question.
I hear you talking a bit about dynamics that surround the work itself, Sara. And my next question, I think, touches on that, although it pivots kind of hard in another direction. But we know that urban economies are increasingly fueled by gentrification. And in this context, public art has emerged as a tool for rebranding post-industrial cities as so-called creative cities, that are sort of framed as the epicenter of urban luxury, leisure, and success. This is kind of a tricky question, and it's not meant to be a gotcha by any stretch of the imagination, but I was wondering how you think about that dynamic as artists, and whether there's anything that artists can do to sort of avoid being co-opted by capitalist planning regimes, and to a word that I heard you mention earlier, Gabriel, if there's anything you can do to subvert that dynamic.
Oh, do you want you start?
No, go ahead.
I was, this makes me think about, there was an art festival here in New Mexico that I was part of a few years ago, the Taos Paseo. And that was a festival that came very much out of the fact that art and public art and art within public spaces in the city of Taos had become a very commodified thing. It was a very the Taos Art Festival every year became very much like sort of tourist oriented imagery of the Southwest, and sort of commodified ceramics and things like that. And it just became more like the artistic practices within the city became very co-opted by commodification. So artists within the city started to think about how they could subvert that and came up with the Taos Paseo, which is an annual now exhibition of participatory and interactive and ephemeral, non-commodifiable artworks, so that people can have, a different sort of experience within the city. So you have performances, you have digital projections, you have things that exist for a finite amount of time, things that can be purchased. And so it seemed like they were sort of going through that kind of dialogue. And a lot of that was conversations within the community and how people within the community felt very distant from its image as like an artsy community and didn't feel involved or connected to the artwork.
Yeah, and I think in many ways that's not unrelated to Leah's question in the chat. What might change if we didn't think about monuments as permanent markers, right? There's like this idea of thinking about art as a lot of people thinking about public art specifically in the same way that a lot of people think about monuments as some kind of like fixed permanent thing, right? I mean, Rachel, you had mentioned, Raquel, you had mentioned about ideas of like the co-opting of capitalist plan regimes where it's like some condos built and then it's like they have some little space in the bottom and they're like, well, this is for art, right? And it's like, okay, well, no, those things usually take the form of, oh, well, let's have some like non-objective abstract set of squares or cubes or something be the public art piece. And it's not like, hey, let's set aside some money for a series of invited artists that invite critical dialogues into the community or something, right? It's never that. So, you know, if there's a way to avoid that, you know, that's also a really difficult question, because, you know, the answer, you know, perhaps is, well, you know, maybe, you know, thinking about the task that we asked you all to do, right? To write down a phrase from what you wrote and deposit it in the public space somewhere for it to be discovered. I think that's one way to go around that. But then at the same time, you know, you have a lot of artists that want to and should be able to live off of their work. And it's like, well, what you know, what kind of money is available? Well, sometimes it's money, you know, for the other kind of project, right? Money coming from people that already have money, that expect some kind of contrived thing to be done in the public space, and that's difficult.
Well, and I really like Leah's question too, because it makes me think about how the idea of a permanent piece of public art in a space as a monument is very much related to the idea of a historical narrative in a place being unchanging, and history as something that we see as fixed within the narrative of public space. So a lot of this conversation around monuments is, well, no, the history within this place isn't fixed. It isn't, you know, the narrative that has always existed or that we've always been fed. There are other sides to the story. There was something that came before, you know, that bronze statue or the person depicted in that bronze statue. So I think this idea of history as something changing sort of subverts the idea that you can have a monument that is like one permanent fixed representation of history.
That's beautiful. My next and perhaps last question, given the time, I think touches on something that you mentioned, Gabriel, when you talked about the intervention that we all were invited to join at the top of our session. But, you know, my question is, you know, it's obvious that you're both practicing professionals with a lot of experience and expertise under your belts. So I was wondering, you know, of course, selfishly, you know, what about the rest of us, right? How can we insert ourselves into the dynamics of public space? How can we reclaim our rights to the cities and communities that we live in? We have one very powerful example that you shared, but I was just wondering, you know, what your ideas are generally on that question.
Sara, do you want to answer that one first?
Yeah, it's interesting because I've been lately very into the work of the Dene poet Jake Skeets, and he has in several of his essays this concept of radical remembering, and that for himself as an Indigenous poet, even the memory of his body in space, or the presence of his body in space, is sort of a radical assertion, you know, that I'm here in this place I'm not supposed to be in. So I've been thinking about that a lot, and about starting with that, just starting with an awareness of, you know, the fact that I am here in this space. What does that mean for me? And I think that maybe the tool that artists can offer, the perspective that artists can offer, is a sort of observational quality within public space. I think artists are constantly aware of and observing and thinking through our surroundings, and starting with awareness and observation in a community is sort of the first way to engage with it. And then beyond that, it's like, you know, the ways we interact with public space are not only creative, right? We can be very involved in our communities politically or socially, or we can be involved in the way policy changes in our environments. So, you know, there are so many zones outside of the arts that that place us actively in our communities.
And Sara, I love how early on this evening you had mentioned libraries and doing the donut mart signs, and how you went to the libraries, and it was like, okay, people knew about it beforehand, but at the same time it was like, hey, whoever's here, we're doing this thing, so come over and join. And I think that's an interesting question, like, how many people go to their local library? How many people know someone in their community, even if it's just by face, or being able to say hello to local business owners, or to be on in email lists for a local organization, and just to kind of get to know what's around you. There's an interesting in Spanish, this saying of like if the idea of saber donde uno está parado, right? Literally meaning like to know where you're standing, and how if somebody doesn't know what's going on, or what really they're up to, or doesn't know how to do their job, or whatever, you would say, él ni siquiera sabe dónde está parado, right? Like they don't even know where they're standing. And then I've been thinking about that expression lately, because it's like, yeah, the importance of knowing, like, dónde estás parado, like where are you, and what are your surroundings? And I think that's easier said than done, but it's a task worth doing.
Thanks for sharing that. I love that. And on that note, I think that's the perfect way to actually bring us to a close. In many ways, tonight's session has been the perfect follow-up to our last session, which was focused on identity and solidarity. And I say that because in the context of a pluralistic democracy, right, what is the public space if not an extension of who we are, our communities, and the values that we hold? What I appreciate so much about contemporary public art, from graffiti to wheat paste to murals and the more ephemeral kind of DIY interventions, is that it invites us to understand the world as something that is dynamic, that our cities are being made and remade with every action, event, and interaction that occurs. And I also think that understanding that invites us to rethink our relationship to public space, to understand that we're not just the passive recipients of designs that are, being dreamed up by someone else, but that we also have a hand in perhaps, co-producing, co-constructing the cultures and communities that we want to live in. Really, that is the fundamental task of democracy. So I'm so grateful to you, Gabriel and Sara, for jumping into this series with your work. This topic is incredibly important. It's been just so beautiful to get to know you as thinkers, as artists, as practitioners, as educators. So thank you so much for joining us and for opening up space for us to wonder and co-dream. I think we did an abundant amount of that in our time together, and opening up space for us to recognize that our communities are places of possibility. Thank you everyone else to being with us tonight. We'll be continuing the Create, Connect, Catalyze series on May 25th with our final event on young people and the arts. So much of our series has been forward-facing, so we're especially looking forward to concluding our series with a focus on how we can perhaps support and cultivate the next generation of artists, creators, and thinkers. Super important topic. We will be here for that in 2 weeks, same place, same time, and we hope to see you all with us. I'm going to hang out for a bit. Feel free to stay if you want to stick around. If not, love to see you next time. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.